what about all these different flavors of theonomy, of reconstruction in essence? We have all sorts of different ideas of what is and isn't still binding in respect to biblical law. And so this creates apparent divisions and arguments, and certainly we don't want to go into an unedifying place. So, it is true that we have some folks that don't accept, say, the entire package. They have their exegetical reasons or theological or dogmatic reasons for saying this part is part of the Old Testament law that is no longer binding, and these other parts are. So the question is, where do we make this divide? Where should we determine that, and on what basis? And there should be a rational basis for saying it, rather than arbitrarily saying, well, I don't like that law, therefore that law has to be abolished and no longer valid, annulled, if you will, abrogated. So there's a big question as to which still applies and which we, therefore, as Christians, would walk under in terms of establishing the law, Romans 3:31. Do we make void the law of God? No. Rather, we establish the law of God. So that is our mission and testimony, right? So we want to make sure that we are not going too far down the wrong path. What's the problem with the wrong path? Is that now if you go too far down the wrong path, you're into the Judaizing area, especially if the law is being used unlawfully, which is to say with respect to justification. Because by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. We must hold this principle clearly in our minds at all time. So this really is a question of what is the pattern for sanctification. And there's differences among Christians. I noticed that in the first Festschrift that was written for Dr. Rushdoony, appeared at his 80th birthday in 96, the foreword was written by Dr. John Frame. And he thought it was interesting that he would be the one asked, because he says, I'm one of those people who agree with Rushdoony 80% of the time, not 95 or 98% of the time. So it's unusual that they'd ask me. Nonetheless, he said, I do wish to very much bring tribute to Dr. Rushdoony. So here's someone who identifies himself as about 80% in line with Dr. Rushdoony. Do we attack him for the other 20% that he is not in line with Dr. Rushdoony? Is Dr. Rushdoony the standard and the bellwether, the determining factor, the plumb line of adherence to God's law? Well, all that has to be sorted out. So let's take a point about priorities. After all, in Matthew 23, we hear that there are weightier matters of the law, and then there's the, obviously, less weighty matters, like tithing, mint, and rue. Our attitude to the law should be that we obey all of it, but the weightier things have to come first. So this becomes now a tactical question. Which hill am I willing to die on? For example, on, say, a matter of dietary law, am I going to make that my initial point of discussion with theonomy, or am I going to deal with the fact that the person I'm talking to has his children in public school? If I have millions of children, Christian children in public school, that has to be my first priority. I can worry about the other aspect later down the line. I need to make the main thing, as has been popularly said. So it's important that our priorities be straight. If we start becoming pharisaical in this regard, and I'm going to have something to say about that when we get to some of these other questions, if we become pharisaical, then we run afoul of Christ's condemnations about that mindset for multiple reasons. So, all that to say is that there's a tendency for folks to say, I have the right amount of God's law in mind that's still binding, and anyone who has fewer laws than I do, let's just say there's 613 laws, and we'll arbitrarily say 300 of them relate to the temple. And then there's a whole bunch that relate to judicial and other matters. If someone says, I hold to 300, anyone holds to 299, there's some kind of antinomian because they missed one. And if they hold to 301, there's some kind of horrible legalist because they added one that I don't hold. So everyone sees themselves as holding the right amount, the right balance, that Goldilocks thing, right? Not too hot, not too cold, and not too many, not too few commandments. And with this attitude, we look down on those who keep fewer of them, and we also look down on those who keep too many of them, because we're right in the dead happy median. We have the Goldilocks theonomy. Goldilocks theonomy is a really bad attitude because we can't work together. At this point, men are being like the Pharisees and scribes and priding themselves, and then they're then going to make their phylacteries wide, as Jesus warned. That's what the equivalent is today of the phylactery, is to be bragging on your particular brand of theonomy and how much superior it is to someone else who fails to meet the test or goes too far. they go too far, they'll say, well, obviously Rushdoony went off the deep end. They'll say he went off the deep end, say, with mixed fiber clothing. And so if you read some of the criticism to Dr. Rushdoony on this point, some folks just say, well, it's obviously wrong. We're not supposed to obey that law anymore. So let's figure out why. Because it's sitting there in the middle of another text between all sorts of moral requirements, and that creates all sorts of interesting tensions in that text of the Old Testament. I believe it's theoretically possible that that commandment is still binding. In other words, to me, it is not an open and shut case. It's something that's worth examining and perhaps trusting God's wisdom on this before we so quickly say it's some kind of seed law. And that's the other thing we do, folks, is that we create boxes and we put the laws that are in that not to be kept in this box and the laws that should be kept over in that box. So we have a form of box theology that we have different kinds of boxes and we classify things. We'll justify them with appeals to the threefold division of the law, say. And the more things we can put in the division of the law that we're not responsible for anymore, the better. Now, there's plenty of things that belong in that box, but there's some areas that are still open to dispute. How do we handle that dispute? At the moment, poorly. At the moment, we use this as one-upmanship in Christendom. Many theonomists have said, you don't need to follow that fellow. He's obviously out to lunch. Follow us. We have the right balance. We're the Goldilocks you want. So this creates a large sector of Christendom in theonomy where division prevails, and then we are known by our fights. And how regrettable that is when there's so many more important things to be concerned about. And we need to have a charitable spirit regarding this, and we don't have it. So we should rather say, this needs more work, rather than it's settled. When you say it's settled, that's also a dangerous position because it needs to be settled if it is a foundational doctrine of the faith, where we know that it is a key foundation stone for truth and the gospel and the law of God being upheld in its entirety in how it applies today. But if we are going to play games and posture, and that's what I'm saying, a lot of folks posture that they have the right Goldilocks theonomy, that gets us in serious trouble. So we need to realize and acknowledge, well, I'm pleased that you see 85% of the law is binding. That's better than 0% of the law, which is the lawless approach. And we need to then work toward a better understanding of the others, rather than saying we're going to appeal to this authority, that authority. And here's a case in point. Mark 7:19 is often used to say Jesus declared all meats clean. But you cannot find that text in the King James Bible or a Geneva Bible. Why is that? Why is that? It's because that text, to even get off the ground, needs a masculine term in there. And in the received text, has it neuter. Get the result. And so if you adopt the notion of the King James Bible as the received text is the Word of God, you will not see that translation because it's impossible. And even if you have the masculine, you have to establish that reading by saying there's a massive 37-word backward leap to the verb lege. And then you say everything between that is a gigantic interpolation and injection. And these words did not come out of Christ's mouth, they came out of Mark's mouth. So we have to actually say, this is not what Christ said, this is what Mark said. That's a dangerous thing, what do you not think? That we at least be cautious and not say, because I help our position on this particular doctrine, I should pull words out of Christ's mouth and stick them in Mark's mouth, or vice versa. You see, it's a problem either way. And because it's a serious problem, we should not be flippant and glib in saying, well, that's a solid problem. It's masculine, the 37-word backward leap makes sense. Actually, it's very, very problematic. And we're switching things from Christ's mouth to Mark's mouth because the actual best match for that word is just two words backward in context, the word ephedroma. So we put this out on the web, not because we want to focus on that issue. We don't. We want to show that that issue is being mishandled, and therefore there's a better way to go. And it should also pull us back from presumption, sins of presumption. Because if we do see through it glass darkly, and we cannot say that theonomists now have pinned down all of biblical law, and we'll see this in some of the next questions coming up, we haven't got it all down. Dr. Rushdoony, like he said, was only scratching the surface of the biblical Bible's application to ethics, to our conduct. And he wanted other generations to come and then labor in the fields, digging deep into the riches and treasures of the Word of God. That's what we need to have, is that attitude. So yes, there are lots of flavors, and lots of folks will say, if you hold to that position, you're no longer really a theonomist. So now we're determining who's a card-carrying theonomist or not. Not edifying, my friends. My brothers and sisters, that's not the way we should be going. We should acknowledge that the other person may be mistaken, but we need also to study to show ourselves a workman approved. And we might have very hastily adopted certain positions, maybe too quickly in favor of a law of God that perhaps is not to be for today, and perhaps the other direction. We've discounted something. God can use our inconsistency, but what is going to hurt us is our schismatic attitude toward these things.